you can't talk about a cell without talking about energy. Every cell needs energy, and the main energy source is going to be ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So where does the ATP come from that all your cells are using? If you're looking at this, we're looking at the food sources are the main intake. There are three main macromolecules that give us our energy. We have our proteins, our complex carbohydrates, and our triglycerides. Now, of those three, a lot of the energy is primarily coming from the carbohydrates. So I'll follow that one down first and work with the other two. Carbohydrates can either be used directly as glucose, or it can be stored in the liver, for that matter, as an energy source for the future as glycogen. Now, if you take that glucose, it can be used directly for energy production, taking ADP to ATP. Now, adenosine triphosphate, you add that extra phosphate on. Each phosphate group is where the bonding occurs, and that bond is the energy. So when your body uses ATP, it breaks a phosphate group off, releasing the energy. Your body can then take that ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then add a phosphate back on to go back to the higher energy state. But that's not the only way to get energy. You get energy from proteins. In proteins, a lot of the protein you're ingesting is going, as you can see here, into amino acids, into tissue formation, structure formation. But you can use that as an energy source also. But here's the catch you got to be careful about. In the tissue, if you're having to use more protein than your body has in storage, you can actually cause the tissues to go through cannibalism, basically breaking down the protein tissues to power the body. So it's a give and take here. You can use some protein, but you don't want to use too much. Otherwise, you're breaking your muscles, breaking your tissues down to get the energy from the proteins. Other side here, we have triglycerides, lipids, fats. Now here again, you can take your glycerol, your fatty acids, your lipids. It can be used as a storage unit. Think cushioning and a little bit of mineral storage. But your body can also break down that fat to be used as an energy source as well. So all three of these can be used as an energy source. Now if you notice, we're only missing one macromolecule. We have carbohydrates, we have lipids, we have proteins. We're not talking about nucleic acids. Yes, you ingest nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, but you're not going to use those as an energy source. So they're not really part of this discussion. What we're primarily going to do, though, is look at the carbohydrates, because carbohydrates is where the main ATP processes will occur. And even if you use the proteins and the lipids, they're going to be converted into a carbohydrate-based structure or a carbon ring structure. And that's what goes through the energy production. So we're looking at the process called glycolysis. Glycolysis is a multi-step process, as you can see here. It's only the first, though, of energy production. We'll start with this glycolysis. We'll move into the citric acid cycle, or known as the Krebs cycle, and then finish off with the electron transport chain. Now, glycolysis, though, is happening outside of the mitochondria. Citric acid Krebs will be inside, same as electron transport. So we're starting off with glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. By this point, we've added a phosphate, added a second phosphate. Well, by adding those phosphates, we're consuming energy. You have to take energy by basically using those bonds to put them onto the glucose molecule. But it's important to add the phosphates because we're going to take that 6-carbon ring and split it into 2 3-carbon rings, or not rings, but structures. Once it's split into the 3-carbon structures, you can actually add more phosphates in there, more power basically, until eventually at the bottom step, you're going to take those 3-carbon structures with their phosphates and then transfer the phosphates back to ATP. You'll notice this happens 4 times. ADP, 2 phosphates, take one of the phosphates off, create ATP, which means all in all, we've created 4 ATPs here, but we used 2 to start with. So you only get a net gain of 2 ATPs from glycolysis. It's energy, but it's not the most efficient way for your body to run, which is why your body takes these 3 carbon structures and puts them into the citric acid cycle, the Krebs cycle. What happens here is we're going to take this acetyl-CoA. So acetyl-CoA is what's put into the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. That then is going to run through, whoops, I want to get rid of that. That's going to run through this cycle, this whole process over and over. The overall goal here is to create high energy molecules. We're creating NADH and FADH2. What's happening is each one of these are starting NAD plus, then you pick up an H, so NADH, and then FAD goes to FADH2. We're picking up electrons here, basically hydrogen ions. By doing this, they're creating high energy molecules. It's these high energy molecules that are going to be used to create more ATP later. That's the citric acid Krebs cycle. As we continue on, we hit the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain is taking the NADH and then NAD+. It's getting rid of that hydrogen ion. You can see the hydrogen ions are being sent up across the membrane. The idea here is getting all these hydrogen ions, all this energy basically, up across the membrane by using these electron transport chain molecules. It's those hydrogen ions, once they're up here in a concentration, that are brought down through the ATP synthase. That enzyme is going to utilize those hydrogen ions coming through to create a new ATP molecule. It ends up taking the ADP, adenosine diphosphate, using that energy that's passing through it to reattach a new phosphate group. So the energy is being taken, that's coming through those hydrogen ions, and being put into this new bond right here. So it's creating that new high energy bond to attach the third phosphate. That's the electron transport chain. Now, glycolysis occurs with or without oxygen, but Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle, and then this electron transport chain needs oxygen. So it's important to have oxygen to be able to have a higher energy production, because this electron transport chain is producing the higher amount of ATPs compared to glycolysis. Here's a summary of what we're looking at. You can see up top in glycolysis, you're starting off building and building all the way down. But the key thing is, at the bottom, this electron transport chain, as you're moving those electrons, that's when you're really generating the ATP. Because we set up in the Krebs cycle, that citric acid cycle, we set up with FADH2 and NADH. Those high energy molecules are used here to create ATP molecules. Electron transport chain, give or take, looking at about 34 ATP in that one step, which means the whole process nets about 36 ATP in total. I say net because you use some, so you can't count that as a wash. But overall, you take glucosin, C6H12O6, plus oxygen. Then you go through this whole process. You end up resulting in water. You end up resulting in carbon dioxide, 36 ATP, and heat as a byproduct. It's not a perfect conversion of energy, so heat is the energy byproduct here. But that is your ATP production if you have oxygen present, because oxygen is the important last step. That oxygen accepts the last hydrogens, making water. And that's how the end of the process is ending here. So actually basically creating water. Your electron transport chain. Overall, that's the way your body's producing energy. If you're in an anaerobic state, so no oxygen, which means you're working out very hard and your muscles can't get enough oxygen fast enough, they're functioning anaerobically. That's only going through glycolysis, 2 ATP per glucose. It'll keep it going, but it's not very efficient. By having enough oxygen going to the tissues, go through the whole process. Energy production. That'll get kind of important as we go through the later steps in the chapters that lead up to the different organs. Talking about all the different organ systems need ATP. So let's come back around. The cell, definitely important to build on for the future of anatomy and physiology.